Can I now ask you to welcome our next speaker, very great friend of mine, Sami Ramadani, who is Iraqi, born in Iraq, and I had the most fascinating evening with him a couple of weeks ago. We sat for 2 hours in a cafe on the Holloway Road discussing the history of Iraq and the Middle East. The conversation only ended because the cafe had to close. Otherwise we'd have stayed all night. Absolutely fascinating, great friend, and has written a great deal on the whole issues surrounding the area and taught an awful lot of people the real truth about the history of the region. Please welcome Sami Ramadani.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think I have to discard my speech basically, because what you heard from George and the other speakers, Seamus and so on, just about covered everything I had written. What I will try to do, not to repeat what they had said, which I think was excellent contribution, throwing light at a very complex situation behind these misleading headlines. So what I'll try to do is, I jotted some notes down quickly while they were talking, is to stress issues that perhaps time did not allow them to go into. One is that how do we combat the hysteria that's being generated by the media? And don't underestimate it. I'm delighted there is such a big crowd tonight, but there are millions out there whose only access to the news is through the mainstream media. They switch on BBC, ITV, they pick up their newspaper the next day. They don't hear what you hear here. They have no access. They don't have the time. They run families. They have to work very hard day and night to make a living and so on. They do not have time to go, even if they are willing to do so, to go on research and find out the truth. So this hysteria that the media is creating is extremely dangerous and damaging. And unless all of us, in whatever way we can, combat this hysteria will have an effect on the public. And the effect that it will have, whether it's France or here, is to stir up feelings of racism, of fearing the unknown, and the unknown here is a monster being created out of the Muslim community or black people or whatever the media creates as a monster for the time being. And monsters that the media create change from one historical period to the next. Early 20th century and up to World War II, it was the Jews. After World War II, if we talk about Britain and the rise of immigration, black immigration to Britain in the 1950s onwards, it became black people and mugging. Young black people became the monsters that young people have to fear when it's dark in the street. And for the last 15, 20 years, and if you want a precise date, since the overthrow of the Shah of Iran in 1979, it's been Islam and Muslims. And you're talking about 1.5 billion people across the globe. You're talking about millions of people who made Europe their home. And that is a really poisonous, dangerous policy. We constantly hear, and rightly so, about the Holocaust. One of the biggest lessons, if not the biggest lesson of the Holocaust, is not to repeat it. But if we allow our politicians and our media to generate so much fear, so much hatred, then you are bound to create an atmosphere in which killing these people becomes justifiable, mistreating them, regarding them as subhuman. This is how racism worked during the Atlantic slave trade until today. Dehumanize your enemy to such an extent that you regard them as subhuman, therefore killing them or abusing them or mistreating them becomes justifiable because they are monsters. This is very, very dangerous what our politicians are doing, and they are doing it in our name. And the process of demonization is so dangerous. Look at what they did in Iraq. I was born in Iraq. I lived most of my young years in Baghdad. They destroyed a great country through a process of demonizing one person. Saddam was our dictator, yes, a brutal dictator. I was one of his victims, so were millions of Iraqis, the majority of the Iraqi people. But they demonized Iraq as a country because through the process of demonizing one person called Saddam. And this process of demonization convinced millions of people, even though there was a majority here in Britain against the war, but still, there were millions who were convinced that this country called Iraq posed a danger to the whole world. Instead of leaving it to the Iraqi people to overthrow their dictator, they sent in hundreds of thousands of troops. They destroyed Iraqi society. They destroyed state structures, even though they are authoritarian state structures that the people would have overthrown eventually, but they did not replace them with anything that could create social cohesion. On the contrary, sowing division, sectarian, Shia against Sunni, Christian against that, and Kurd against Arab, and so on. They sowed so much division and discord and created a constitution which was so sectarian. Our press here calls it a Shia state. No, it's not a Shia state. It is a sectarian state created by instituting a sectarian constitution which brought about a state which relies heavily on political forces that sow discord in society to maintain their power. And they destroyed so much of the social cohesion and state structures, they created an environment for the growth of terrorism. And George mentioned that they haven't read Frankenstein to the end. And I say they have read it to the end, probably. They do not mind creating enemies like that. The enemies they hate are great mass movements. And these terrorists are not mass movements. They are isolated, small groups of bandits and gangsters and murderers. These are small minority type forces that the enemy, even if they don't arise, they would love to create. Because these are enemies they can ultimately deal with through a process of suppression and increased repression and more authoritarian laws. Their enemy ultimately is great mass movements, and these great mass movements are democratic movements, whether in Arab countries, Muslim countries in general, or here in Britain. George mentioned how they are spying on the media. They spy on trade unions. They spy on environmental movements. They employ secret policemen to infiltrate environmental movements here in Britain. They fear mass movements. And this is where our strength is. Appeal to the broader masses, expose the media lies, and try to reach the people where the media stops people from learning about the truth of the situation. Saudi Arabia was mentioned, Qatar, Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. All these terrorists, if not 90, about 90% of them, I would say, that crossed into Syria and beefed up ISIS, beefed up al-Nusra Front in Syria, and strengthened their presence in Iraq, came through Turkey. Until today, there is a CIA center publicly acknowledged in the United States, which was established in Turkey to coordinate the infiltration of armed men and equipment into Syria from Turkey. Until today, it's there in Turkey. They still are insisting on overthrowing the Syrian government. Israel, Henry Kissinger, and Turkey and Qatar are tactically a bit different now from the Saudi ruling family and the United States relatively, because Israel, Henry Kissinger, and some of the neocons, Turkey and Qatar, want to overthrow the Syrian government first, then handle ISIS, while Saudi Arabia and others prefer to limit the power of ISIS first, then overthrow the Syrian government. There is a tactical difference that has emerged in the area. But both these camps are anti-people camps, whether they are led by Saudi Arabia or by Turkey and Qatar in terms of the domestic and regional forces. The United States tries to balance these forces in the region. But ultimately, what they are trying in the area is sow division, sow discord, try and control the region, and ultimately even wage a war against Iran, because this area is still a powder keg. The elephant in the room that was mentioned earlier is also Israel. Israel is benefiting from what ISIS is doing and what the terrorists are doing in the region. Netanyahu is on the record. The Israeli ambassador to Washington, former ambassador who left his job only last year, is on the record as saying the bad guys, and I quote him, the bad guys that are allies of Iran and Syria are more dangerous than the bad guys of Al-Qaeda and obviously ISIS. This is how they view the region. This is what they are aiming to do. They're trying to destroy the three major Middle Eastern countries that might pose a threat in the future to Israeli expansion: Iraq, Syria, and ultimately Egypt too. These are targets for destabilization and for destroying their social cohesion and destroying them as viable societies in which the democratic movements of these countries could change these regimes, but they want to stop this process and they would rather destroy these states. Israel is now on the record as celebrating the obliteration of Sykes-Picot borders. Sykes-Picot borders were the borders created by Britain and France following World War I. These borders were hated by the peoples across the Middle East because they were created falsely by Britain and France to divide the region. Israel now is celebrating it, and on the same day that Netanyahu celebrated it, the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, in his inaugural speech of his so-called Islamic State, said the Sykes-Picot is dead. This is not the death of the Sykes-Picot that the people of the region want. What Israel is doing, what ISIS is doing, what imperialism is doing, maybe is to redraw the maps in the name of redrawing Sykes-Picot, but they want to establish weak, divided regions and states. Iraq into three, Syria into 3 or 4 divided regions, Egypt in future, because there are about 10 million Coptic Christians in Egypt. They want to stir up that one in the long term. Places they cannot control, they want to destroy. And this is what is happening for the last 10, 15, 20 years. They have failed to control Iraq, they have failed to control Syria, they have failed to control Iran, and the economic system in the West and the crisis of capitalism is pushing them towards more aggression, where they fail to control, whether it's the oil prices, oil production, or the control of strategic region. They would rather see these societies destroyed if they cannot control them. And this is really what is behind the so-called headlines about terrorism. These are murderous terrorists, but Western policies are laying the grounds for even greater tragedies, because these big wars are killing millions, have killed millions. They killed 3 million people in Vietnam. They killed over 1 million people in Algeria. They killed over 1 million people in Iraq. They're killing hundreds of thousands of people, whether in Syria, Libya. They destroyed the Libyan state, the Syrian state, the Iraqi state, and this is what is happening in terms of the growth of terrorism, where the people's democratic movements are not allowed to flourish. So our job is to expose these lies. I know it's a hard task, but with every person's effort, especially young people in this country, this dark period, this campaigning of racism will come to an end. Thank you very much.